But it's my great privilege to introduce our first speaker, Reverend Don Sr., who's president here at Catholic Theological Union. So we get to thank you again for your hospitality here, which has been fantastic so far. And he also serves as a member of the faculty as a professor of New Testament. He's a frequent lecturer, serves on numerous boards and commissions, and is widely published. He's the immediate past president of the Association of Theological Schools, for which all of us in theological education are grateful. And he's been active in interreligious dialogue, particularly with the Jewish and Muslim communities, and serves as vice president of the Council of Religious Leaders of Metropolitan Chicago. Welcome, or I guess welcome to the rest of us, since this is your home. We look forward to hearing your...
Well, good morning, everybody. And it really is both, I feel like I'm entering into your home and you are in our home. And I just want to say what a wonderful privilege it is to have the Summer Institute here. I thank Bill and his colleagues for being willing to come. For us, it's a tremendous privilege and honor, and the vitality that I felt since you've been here is just tremendous. So thank you for that. And I hope you do feel completely welcome. Chicago is a great city. It's warm today as a sign of the warm embrace of you being here. And we're the city that works, the city that sweats the summer. So welcome. I became a little bit nervous when Lisa said that, talking about access and inclusion might be a waste of time. I thought I'd tear up my talk, but I know the spirit in which she meant it and appreciated so much the beautiful prayer this morning and Lisa's reflections. So my title is Access and Inclusion, and trying to look at it from the vantage point of the biblical vision. And I suppose I should say the Christian biblical vision. For all of us who've been involved in various ways in the subject of this institute, the terms access and inclusion are very familiar. And that good old theological source, Webster's Dictionary, defines access as a coming towards or near to, an approach, the right to come into, admittance. Inclusion, on the other hand, is defined as an including or being included, or I think this rings true, something included, especially a foreign body encased in mineral or rock. So that sounds familiar. In a way, when you think about it, of course, the two words refer, seems to me, to the same phenomena or the same dynamic, but from different vantage points. Access leans toward the perspective of the person on the outside, trying to find a way to get in or to gain rightful admittance. Inclusion, on the other hand, seems to represent the vantage point of the person on the inside, and whether or not a foreign body can be included or admitted into one's community or group. Now, these dynamic terms and their implications, as you know, can be and have been viewed from a number of perspectives. Sociological perspectives can define various social groups and how and on what basis membership is determined. A political perspective, likewise, can determine which groups have representation, and especially here in Chicago, what clout they have within a particular political body or issue, and who doesn't, who's in and who's out. And as we know from a now long and continuing struggle in our own country and elsewhere, the terms of access and inclusion can be viewed from a legal point of view. Who has the right to access to a particular resource or community, and who determines these matters and on what conditions? All of these are important and valid perspectives, even for theological reflection. But what I want to offer you for your consideration together with you this morning is another vantage point, namely the significance of the concepts, the realities of access and inclusion from a biblical point of view, particularly from the perspective of the New Testament. I don't want to claim that it's a comprehensive or a dispassionate analysis of the biblical materials. It is frankly confessional. It's from the Christian vantage point, and it's one that I have found very useful in my own wrestling with these issues. So let me start. Some years ago, I read a novel by Barbara Gordon, whose mood and content have stayed with me for a long time. It was entitled, "I'm Dancing as Fast as I Can." Some of you may be familiar with it. It was about the struggle of a very successful executive for CBS television. It's sort of an autobiographical novel. She had reached the pinnacle of her career as a major executive, but suddenly, under the impact of a frantic pace and extraordinary pressures, her life began to fall apart. A shattered marriage, a terrible falling out with her only daughter, unaccustomed setbacks and loss of purpose in her work. And gradually, she sank into a deep depression, into mental illness, literally locking herself away in her apartment, afraid to come out, nearly suicidal. The novel, which was based on a real story, deals mainly with this woman's struggle to put her life back together. One key moment came when, in an excruciating bout of panic, she told her doctor, whom she had called, that she literally did not know how to live anymore. She was afraid to step out of her bed. The doctor came and visited with her for a while and said to her, "You know, you do know one thing very important. You know how to breathe." And he asked the woman to be still for a moment and to listen to herself breathe, breathing in and breathing out. Years later, after a long, steep climb to put her life back in order, the woman recalled that moment as a turning point for her. She did know how to breathe, taking in life breath and letting it out, the vital exercise that keeps a human being alive. That fundamental act, breathing in and breathing out, is something of an image I would like to use this morning in this reflection on the biblical vision of access and inclusion. This is a very turbulent time for our world and for our churches. In the midst of great vitality and blessing all around us, there's also much pain and loss, as we all know. People still suffer from the uncertainty and constraints of our economy. Many are out of work. Some families' homes are threatened with foreclosure or have already experienced it. A lot of people find themselves checking the stock market these days to see where their retirement funds are going. And there seems to be an earthquake happening in the Middle East with signs of hope, but also a situation whose final outcome is not assured. And we get daily reports on the terrible violence, for example, in Syria. And we have violence and deep divides here in our own city. Chicago, these past few months, is really going through a paroxysm of violence, especially affecting children. Often our political discourse, and we have a long season ahead of us, is confrontational and at times even crude. And of course, the scandal of sexual misconduct has scarred some people we thought were heroes and has affected the church itself and raised profound and fundamental questions about its moral leadership. So we too may feel we're dancing as fast as we can. We too may need to turn to the deepest wellsprings of our spiritual heritage at a time like this and find new inspiration and vitality. I suspect this is a fundamental reason why most of us are here together. Breathing in and breathing out, that primal human work, is also a metaphor that I think applies to the mission of Jesus of Nazareth. One of the ways I've come to think of his ministry is something like the work of breathing, the extending of life to the farthest boundaries of reality, a drawing in of life into a vital center. A gesture similar also to an embrace, reaching out and drawing in. And the more I've stood back from the Gospels, the more I conceive of Jesus' mission in terms of these two related gestures that become one fluid movement and characterize the fundamental elements of Jesus' ministry as presented in the Gospels: reaching out and drawing in, breathing out and breathing in. Both gestures were compelled by the deepest convictions and religious instincts of Jesus' life and his vocation. Reaching out in a wide embrace of the whole expanse of Israel, including those on the margins, drawing in the entire community, washed and unwashed, into a communion of life that gives glory to God. One of my favorite texts, one that the early church surely could not have invented, is that of Matthew chapter 11, verse 18. On your notes, by the way, I put the pertinent biblical text for you to look at later if you care. You recall the text where Jesus confronts his opponents in Matthew's gospel, playing back their own hostile words. We piped you a tune and you did not dance. We sang you a dirge and you did not wail. For John the Baptist came neither eating or drinking, and you said he is insane. But the Son of Man came eating and drinking, and you say, behold, a wine bibber and a glutton, a lover of tax collectors and those outside the law. Yet wisdom is proved by her deeds, Jesus says. Implicit in his opponent's hostile response is, in fact, a tribute to the two characteristic gestures of Jesus I spoke of: a lover of tax collectors and those outside the law, a sign of Jesus' extraordinary outreach beyond the boundaries. Jesus was committed to restoring Israel to God, hence in a spirit of compassion, he sought out also those who lived on the margins of the community, those on the fringe, the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And at the same time, this wine bibber and glutton drew in the lost to the vital center where he would break God's bread with them. Here we see tribute to the inclusive meal so characteristic of Jesus' mission as portrayed in the Gospels. Both of these gestures, reaching out and drawing in, are fundamental to the gospel portrayals of Jesus. No contemporary study of the historical Jesus would deny the fact that Jesus had extraordinary rapport with those on the margin, with those who were isolated and alienated within the social context of first century Palestinian Judaism. Think, for example, of the gospel's emphasis on Jesus' commitment as a charismatic healer. All one has to do is read the opening chapter of Mark's gospel to see in such raw and powerful detail Jesus healing from sunup to sundown, the doors jammed with the sick who come to him as if drawn by some magnetic force. Healing, then as now, is not only physical transformation, Jesus was surely dedicated to that, but healing also involves the dissolving of isolation and exclusion, which the sick in traditional societies, but also in our own, characteristically experience. It's interesting that virtually all of Jesus' encounters with Gentiles in the gospel literature are in the context of healing. This reflects in part the inherent boundary-breaking nature of the healing stories in the New Testament. In most of the stories, both the healer, Jesus, and the one to be healed perform a boundary-breaking movement, reaching across the chasms of taboo, culture, indeed the boundary between life and death, in order to experience healing. Healing is very important, I think, especially for us, has a comprehensive sense, involving not only physical transformation or physical cure. I think we can make that distinction. The Gospels don't, but I think we know from experience. Cure may reflect physical transformation. Not everybody needs or desires curing, but healing has a more profound sense, a spiritual, psychological, social justice dimension. Language of liberation is often used in the gospel healing stories, particularly when demonic possession is described as oppressive, as in the case of the Gadarene demoniac in Mark chapter 5, or the woman bent double in Luke chapter 13. From the New Testament perspective, at least, the Christian mission of liberation can find a profound basis in the healing mission of Jesus. which frees people from overwhelming experiences of evil, which dehumanize and oppress them. Healing or exorcism takes the form of liberation from evil and inclusion in a community of life. The transformations involved in the healing stories include not only the physical, social, and spiritual condition of the person who has this condition, but also profound challenge to and transformation of the community itself. Thus, in the story of the woman bent double in Luke 13, the liberation of the woman by Jesus is seen as a profound disturbance to the order of the synagogue on the part of the synagogue manager. He's an administrator. I understand exactly what he went through. Let's keep the schedule, you know. Jesus vigorously champions the right of the woman, a daughter of Abraham, as he calls her, a rare designation, to be healed on the Sabbath. The healing of the Gadarene demoniac in Mark chapter 5, an obvious mission story, brings chaos and disruption to the village when the demons enter into the herd of pigs and the Gentile demoniac is restored to full participation in his community. They ask Jesus to leave. In the story of the healing of the daughter of the Canaanite woman in Matthew 15, it seems to be Jesus himself who finds his assumptions challenged. No longer is his mission, as he had claimed, only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, now that he has encountered this Gentile woman and her insistent faith on behalf of her daughter. Now they have made entry into the circle of his ministry. These stories tap into a powerful, inclusive dynamic within the gospel literature. A dynamic captured not only in the healing stories, but in materials as diverse as Jesus' signature teaching on love of enemies, for example, his call of Levi and other social outcasts to be his disciples, and his parables such as the famous mercy parables of Luke 15 on the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost son, which all deal with the importance and joy in heaven over embracing the lost and the excluded, and the radical emphasis also we can note on the obligations to forgiveness and reconciliation, for example, in the community discourse of Matthew 18. These examples could be magnified and expanded. In all of this material, Jesus draws the outcast, the marginalized, the alienated, the oppressed into the vital circle of community. At the same time, calling the community itself to conversion and openness. Those on the margins who came to Jesus instinctively realized that he respected them as they were, welcomed their own boundary-crossing determination, called it faith, by the way, and defended their rights to belong against those who would exclude them. Thus, healing, understood in the context of the Gospels, is not, as I say again, just physical cure, but in a broad and inclusive sense, was an intrinsic part of the early Christian understanding of its mission. This healing has a tremendous, the early bishops in some of the patristic texts were called the healers. They were the physicians. Consider, too, as part of the expansive nature of his mission, Jesus' eye for the socially marginalized. We're talking about this in our prayer. Levi at his tax collector's post, the centurion in Capharnaum, the Canaanite woman, blind Bartimaeus by the roadside, Zacchaeus in the sycamore tree. It is also clear from the Sermon on the Mount and many other sayings and parables of Jesus that he was convinced that those devalued by others were themselves capable of heroic virtue. Jesus of the Gospels had great faith in the capacity of the human person for holiness and greatness. I think this is a fundamental assumption of the Sermon on the Mount and its breathtaking expectations of the capacity of the human person for forgiveness and holiness. There is no doubt that the historical Jesus reached out beyond the boundaries, and there is also no doubt, I believe, that this provocative outreach was grounded in his own experience of the God of Israel as one whose reach was not confined to the boundaries of Israel, but reached beyond those boundaries. Jesus, it seems, opened his mind and heart to the occasional Gentile as well, As a devout Jew, Jesus did not frequent Gentile territories. We don't see evidence of that in the Gospels. Nor did he conceive a mission to the Gentiles as his primary mission, as one called to restore. Rather, his primary mission he saw as one called to restore Israel. But when he was confronted with one of God's children in need, even if a Gentile, he apparently responded with compassion. We think of the centurion in Capharnaum, concerned about his sick servant, or the Canaanite woman desperate for her sick daughter, or the Gerasene man isolated and tormented and self-destructive among the tombs. Thereby, Jesus set the foundation for what the early community would ultimately feel compelled to do, and it took them a while under the inspiration of the Spirit to see it clearly that they were to reach beyond Israel in the name of Jesus while revering their connection to Israel. Jesus earned and gloried in the judgment of his enemies, a lover of tax collectors and those outside the law. And then there is the dimension of his drawing in, his breathing in, the inclusive thrust of Jesus' mission. Clearly, an important way of understanding the Jesus of history is not that he came to found a church in the sense of establishing a completely new entity apart from the community of Israel. The church, in a sense, was already there, the Kahal of God, the assembly or ecclesia of Israel. Jesus, I think, rather saw as his God-given vocation the restoration of Israel, the renewal, the breathing of new life and a deeper sense of community into the people created by God and sealed with the Sinai covenant. So Jesus, in a burst of wonderful irony and God-given optimism, would call his ragtag and vulnerable band of disciples the 12 and promise them that they would sit on the thrones of the tribes of Israel. Perhaps he laughed when he said that. And surely is the inner meaning of the extraordinary meals that seem to have been a characteristic of the ministry of Jesus. I list them on the notes you have. I won't cite all of these. It's rather extraordinary. Someone said you can eat your way through the Gospels. Meals with Levi and his friends, meals with Simon the Pharisee, meals with the crowds on the hillside, meals with his disciples. The ideal meals that are described in his parables, wedding feasts in which the invitations are extended to the highways and byways, royal banquets groaning with food and seeking guests, meals at which strangers would come from east and west and sit at table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Passover meals drenched with poignancy and longing. The early community would see these characteristic meals as evocative of God's feeding the people in the desert with manna and with quail, and also as a sign of Eucharist to come. In each case, they signify the ultimate meaning of Jesus' mission as a gathering of Israel, as an inclusive communion of all the children of God, as a sign of the ultimate communion in joy and praise and abundant vitality with the God of Israel, who in the vision of Isaiah 25 would set a banquet on Zion and feed the people with choice meats and beautiful wines, taking away the cobweb of death and drying the tears from every face. The mission of Jesus, understood in these terms of outreach and drawing in, of inclusion and communion, of breathing out and breathing in, would also lead ultimately to his death. He crossed many boundaries. He rubbed many thoughts and perspectives and inclinations the wrong way, and would ultimately give meaning to the cross as an act of profound love, the transformation of that event that the Gospels perform, particularly the Gospel of John. Jesus, we can say, died because of the way he lived. Thus, the characteristic notes and deep patterns of Jesus' ministry, his reaching out and his drawing in, can ultimately be traced to Jesus' own experience of the God of Israel, a God who is not a tribal God, but a God of the nations, a God whose transcendent beauty reached far beyond the boundaries of Israel's imagination and far exceeded its hopes by its own testimony, by the testimony of the Scriptures. A God whose unconditional love and startling compassion were more than any heart could grasp. This God was the ground of Jesus' being and the foundation of his mission. The Spirit-driven intuition of the early community would enable it to see that Jesus not only revealed this God through his ministry, but in the perspective of Christian faith, that Jesus himself in his very being embodied this divine reality. And here we touch on another intuition of the Church's teaching about the Christian mission that has come to the fore in our times, namely that the ultimate theological and biblical foundation for mission is the very life of God, indeed the mystery of the Trinity itself, as we heard in Lisa's reflections. God embodies the mission impulse, reaching out in self-transcending love, love as an incredible, irrepressible abundance emanating from the very relational being of God, love surging out into the act of creation, love extending into the life of a people and their history, and a love whose ultimate intent is to draw all creation into the unfathomable beauty and vitality of God's own being, to create a communion among all living things. Here is the ultimate life act, breathing out and breathing in, reaching out and drawing in. This divine rhythm of life is the ground of all mission. In a wonderful book on mission in the Old Testament, Lucien Legrand points out that this divine rhythm finds an echo in a dynamic tension inherent in Israel's own life as presented in the Scriptures. Legrand sees a fundamental dynamic already apparent in the Old Testament, where Israel stretches on the twin poles of its election as God's chosen people and its historic interaction, perhaps we might even say mission to the nations. It's sort of caught in this dynamic. Although Israel conceived of its own status as unique and compelling as God's people, it also understood that the God of Abraham and Sarah, the God of Israel, was also the God of the nations. Inevitably, therefore, Israel had to deal with the nations, at times standing over against its surrounding cultures in the name of religious purity and identity, at other times interacting with the nations and absorbing fundamental aspects of their cultural life and religious structures, and still at other times experiencing the nations as instruments in God's own purification or chastisement of Israel, like Cyrus. We think, for example, of the wonderful story of Jonah, the reluctant prophet who tries so hard to escape God's commission for him to go to the people of Nineveh. Even the sea monsters will not allow Jonah to escape. And in the wonderful irony and humor of the Bible, when Jonah finally brings his message of repentance to the Ninevites, those loathsome outsiders, lo and behold, they actually hear Jonah's message. They put on sackcloth and they repent. And wonderfully, it is the success of his mission that makes Jonah depressed. It's great to be depressed. One of my predecessors once told me, as I was taking on the job of president here, he says, be careful not to try to make people happier than they want to be. So I found that is real wisdom, So Jonah is successful, and it throws him into a depression. Who would have thought that the Ninevites were capable of anything? And so God chides Jonah, who at the end of the story is more concerned about the death of a gourd plant that had given him some shade than he is about the fate of the people of Nineveh. And so God speaks to him. Then the Lord said, you are concerned over the plant, which cost you no labor and which you did not raise. And should I not be concerned over Nineveh, the great city in which there are more than 120,000 persons who cannot distinguish their right hand from their left? Not to mention the many cattle. It's that part I liked. What about the cows, for goodness sake? The people, yes, right? But so it's a beautiful text told with this kind of tweaking, loving humor, I think, against the, too much ethnocentrism, and the God of the nations is out there. That dynamic tension between identity and outreach, between community and mission, between particularism and universality arches through the entire Bible, including both Testaments. Israel caught throughout its history between its sense of election as God's own special people, concerned with the demands of the covenant to build a community of justice and compassion, yet from time to time wondering about the nations, those people who were also children of Abraham and somehow destined to be part of God's ultimate embrace. Election and outreach, community and mission, breathing in and breathing out, access and inclusion. Allow me for a few moments to round out this portrayal of Jesus' mission in terms of access and inclusion by turning for a moment to the Apostle Paul, in whose life and mission these dynamics were clearly at work. We encounter Paul in the Acts of the Apostles, first as a prime example of one who was driven by a spirit of exclusion in a deadly way. He holds the coats for those who stoned Stephen, and Paul himself was a violent enemy of this new Jewish Christian movement that seemed to be relativizing the demands of the law, reaching out to Gentiles in an unseemly way, and therefore diluting the essential boundaries that define Judaism in Paul's eyes. But on the road to Damascus, Paul's life is transformed by a dramatic vision of the crucified and risen Christ, who challenges Paul, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" The Jesus of the Gospels, who identified with the least, "Whatever you do to me, you do to the least of my disciple," appears again as the risen Christ in Luke's narrative, still identifying with those others held in contempt and who were refused access to the vital center of the community. Blinded by the light of God's forgiving love, Paul paradoxically would begin to see the truth for the first time. In breathing threats against innocent and vulnerable people, Paul was wounding the crucified Christ, who identified with the least. The remarkable drama of the Acts of the Apostles is that through the grace and ministry of the early Christian community, as we know, Paul of Tarsus, persecutor of the church, would now become the chosen vessel, as Acts calls him, the restless apostle to the Gentiles, one who would carry God's message of liberation and inclusion to the ends of the earth. In Paul's own letters, acute embarrassment about his earlier role as persecutor of the church appears again and again. But his own account of his initial transformation is remembered in a different way than Luke presents it. In the opening chapter of the letter to the Galatians, as he reflects on his own apostolic vocation, Paul again recalls that because of his zeal for his ancestral traditions, as he said, he had persecuted the church of God beyond measure and tried to destroy it. These are Paul's own words. But he goes on to say that God had set him apart for what would become the work of his life, his inclusive mission to the Gentiles. God had set him apart from the first moment of his human existence in his mother's womb, not on the road to Damascus, but long before in the recesses of God's providential love. That God had called him through God's grace to proclaim the gospel to the nations. Paul's vision of an inclusive community of God, he claims, was divinely ordained. Paul is citing here the extraordinary chapter of Isaiah 49, where the prophet recalls his own boundary-breaking call from God that is also echoed by Jeremiah when he recalls his prophetic call. Quote, "The Lord called me from birth. From my mother's womb, he gave me my name. I will make you a light to the nations, that my salvation may reach to the ends of the earth." For Paul, the inclusive vision of the church was rooted deep in the understanding of the nature of God in the Hebrew Scriptures and in the death and resurrection of Jesus, his son. The God of Israel, Paul remembered, was also the God of the nations. The God of Abraham and Sarah was also the God of the Gentiles. This is a fundamental theme of Paul's most elaborate theological reflection in his letter to the Romans, and it underwrites Paul's profound vision of the gospel which he preached. All people, Jew and Gentile, are sons and daughters of the one God who is Father of all. No one, no culture could be excluded. Before God there is neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, neither male nor female, but all one in Christ Jesus, Paul's famous formulation. But we need to note in particular that the very heart of Paul's theology and his spirituality and his sense of mission were rooted in his profound love for Christ. For Paul, the dying and rising of Jesus Christ was the reality that explained all reality, that revealed the true face of God. In the light of the passion of the Paschal mystery, Paul rethought and rediscovered what he considered the heart of his Jewish tradition. The God of Abraham was the God of the nations. The God of Jesus crucified was revealed not in the trappings of power and splendor, but in the marvel of what some humans counted as weakness, a life poured out for others. Through his contemplation of the crucified Jesus, Paul came to understand that the awesome and transcendently beautiful God of Israel identified not only with those in the center of the community, but especially with those on the perimeter, those whom others considered to be weak and despised and worthy of exclusion. The God of Israel was the defender of the widow, the orphan, and the sojourner. The God of Israel was the one who blunted the power of Pharaoh in favor of a ragtag group of slaves whom he brought from Egypt to freedom in the land of Israel. Those defining memories and fundamental master symbols of the Bible were seen anew in Jesus, the crucified Christ, who identified with the least, who called sinners and those pushed to the margin, who reached out into the highways and byways to fill his banquet table, who crossed boundaries to give access, who embraced those excluded in order to form an inclusive community. Through his contemplation of the crucified Christ and the paradoxical truth that the transcendent God revealed himself to the world in this way, Paul would see his own physical and spiritual experience in a new light and find empowerment. Paul himself, we know, had some physical disability, debated exactly what it was, but we know it was visible to his community and his opponents by his own testimony. Paul, who suffered rejection by the leaders of his own Christian community, who found torment from them, as he says in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. Paul, who came to realize that he held the treasure of his faith in the God of Jesus Christ in a fragile earthen vessel. Paul, who passionately testified that he was afflicted in every way, but not constrained, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, always carrying about in his body the dying of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our body. This Paul would travel more than 10,000 miles during his lifetime to reach out to the peoples of the world. This Paul would passionately urge his communities to avoid factions and exclusions and become one body in Christ. For Jews, as he says, demand signs, and Greeks desire wisdom. But we proclaim Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. For God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength. From this center, Paul would contemplate everything. The heart of Christian life was love, as it was the unconditional love that animated the crucified Christ. The experience of limitation and so-called weakness, as Paul experienced in his own mortal body, would find meaning in the crucified body of Jesus, who gave himself for us. The body of Christ that was the church would give the greatest honor to its most weak and least honorable members, as quote unquote, because God had revealed himself to the world through a crucified Messiah. And thus the body of Christ, the church, was and is a crucified body in which the wounds are still visible. And the apostolic sufferings and wrenching heartache Paul experienced in the course of his ministry, or his communities experienced in their struggles and sufferings, were not in vain, because the cross of Jesus had forever affirmed that through God's grace, from death comes abundant life. This imbibing of the Spirit of Christ is the ultimate foundation for what Paul would call his ministry of reconciliation. The vision to bring together into one peoples who lived in alienation, to break down the dividing wall between peoples. As he told his fractious Corinthian community, there are different kinds of spiritual gifts, but there is the same Spirit. There are different forms of service, but the same Lord. There are different workings, but the same God who produces all of them in everyone. The letter to the Ephesians, probably written later by a disciple as a kind of summation of Paul's vision, puts it this way in a famous passage we all remember, speaking of the mission of Jesus, and because of that, the mission of Paul. For Christ is our peace. He has made both one and broke down the dividing wall of enmity through his flesh, abolishing the law with its commandment and legal claims, that he might create in himself one new person in place of the two, thus establishing peace and might that reconcile both with God in one body through the cross, putting that enmity to death by it. He came and preached peace to you who are far off and peace to those who were near, for through him we both have access in one Spirit to the Father. You've been patient, and let me conclude with just a couple of brief observations, but I think some of the implications of what I've been trying to convey about the biblical vision. First of all, if breathing out and breathing in can in some way be thought of as a metaphor for the divine act in the world, if reaching out in a gesture of justice and compassion across the boundaries of human life and creation and drawing it into a vital communion of life and love defines the mission of Jesus, then this is also the fundamental mission of the church and of every form of ministry within the church. Opening access for those who are arbitrarily excluded from the boundaries of the human community or the church itself, and reaching out to those who've been marginalized, to include them within a community, to learn from them, to welcome them, to forge communion with them. These are not optional views or possible enhancements or possible choice, but rather the fundamental and essential components of the Christian vision. What we're talking about here is at the heart of the matter. Secondly, the experience of exclusion with so many people who may have a visible physical disability know only too well, and the resulting struggle for access and inclusion also illumine and provide wisdom for so many other profound challenges our society faces at this time. All of us can form the list: the growing exclusion of the poor in our country and elsewhere from access to the resources they need to live, the sharp ideological polarities in our political allegiances and political discourse that has brought our country almost to a standstill, the social and religious prejudice that leads to Islamophobia, just as it has for so long fed anti-Semitism, the callous and terrible abuse of children and the vulnerable, ignored by elites within the church and the academy, and so many other sectors of life, who would rather protect their standings than reach out to those who have suffered. The list can go on. Finding again, through the experience and courageous and tenacious struggles and demands for justice on the part of persons with disabilities and their allies, the ability and strength that enables peoples to cross boundaries, to take the risk, to remove barriers, to find communion with others, can give witness and wisdom to a society that is so laced with arbitrary boundaries and ideologies of exclusion. A couple of years ago, Archbishop Elias Shakur, the Archbishop of the Greek Catholic Diocese of Galilee, that's sort of a great title, isn't it, to be the Archbishop of Galilee? But anyway, he spoke here at C2, in fact, in this room. As you may know, if you know of him, he is a remarkable man whose own identity spans several deep boundaries. He is a Palestinian by birth, he's a citizen of Israel, and he's a Christian. And speaking of his own life's work of trying to reconcile Jew, Muslim, and Christian in the Middle East, he remarked that it is important to remember that before we became Jews or Christians or Muslims, We were first born as human beings. We are human beings first. That's the primal baptism, the primal sacrament. Children of the one God. And only at a second moment identified by our different religious traditions. And this is the fundamental basis of our human identity, our birth. And this was precisely the basis that the Second Vatican Council, in its now famous decree, Nostra Aetate, declared as the reason to abhor prejudice and to work for unity. Access and inclusion, breathing in and breathing out, both are vital to human life. And that is our story. Thank you.
Thank you. Is this one on? Oh, there we go. Thank you very much for that. I love that sense of breathing in and breathing out. You can't escape that. Thank you for that gift for all of us. We have about 15 minutes to take questions.
Right.
So if you can, I'll let you field those. We'll pass the mic around. We're not in any hurry, so wait till you get the microphone. Just signal that you want it. I guess Lynn is offering to run around in this.
All right, Lynn.
So questions?
Questions, comments, protests, murmurs, these are all biblical responses. So. Steve.
Father, in the story of Bartimaeus, they asked, who sinned, to make this man blind? Was it the parents or himself? And he
Yes.
said, no, he was created like everybody else was to show forth the glory of God. Could you say something about how Jesus helped to free people from that sense of disability being a result of somebody's sin?
Yeah, the story of the man born blind, right, is the one who sinned, this man or his parent. There's different levels here, and this is a very important point pastorally that you're raising. The Bible does connect sickness, certain conditions of disability with sin, but on a very different level, the same way it connects all of our mortality with sin. I mean, the Bible in its ensemble, it has various modalities to it, as you know, but in its ensemble, the Bible associates life with God, and it associates death with the demonic, ultimately. God did not create death like the Book of Wisdom. Humans made a pact with evil and invited it in. That's sort of the opening, that's sort of like the Genesis story recast in the opening chapter of the Book of Wisdom. So on one level, the fact that we are mortal, expressed through our limitations, whatever those might be, illness or immobility or something like that, is one sign of the assault of evil on the beauty of creation. Okay? So there's a connection between sin in that sense, mortality, in the Bible's vision of things. So Jesus comes, his healing ministry is part of a restoration. It's a defeat of oppression. And a lot of liberation language, as I touched upon, is liberating that. But the point, that's a different point than saying what the Bible had struggled with and rejected in various ways. We think of Job to say, well, I did something wrong, and therefore, I have the flu, or I have some condition. An immediate connection, a cause-effect connection, and that if I have enough faith, I could overcome this. How many stories do we hear of, well-intentioned, I suppose, people coming up and saying, if you had enough faith, you could get up out of your chair and walk, that kind of easy connection, which the Bible does not make. You have the text there, who sinned, neither this man, about the Galileans of whom the tower fell, you remember, and who sinned. So I think there's like two levels, and it takes some explaining to connect it, or to separate them. But pastorally, I think it's very important to know Jesus he embraced and drew in the people. He was accused of associating with sinners, but he didn't view them that way. He embraced them and was in their company. This is part of he's a lover of tax collectors and those outside the law. And I think this is something we cling to, even if we can't explain it so clearly. But there's he welcomed people in. I think that example is probably the best thing we can offer to somebody. We were talking last night, about when parents or family members of somebody who's ill may have a sort of an operative theology that might seem to us destructive. What did we go wrong? Why is this person sick? What did we do wrong? This kind of thing. Or God's punishing us. God has sent this to us. I think people hammer out their own theology. It's what I've come to believe. And sometimes it's a theology that may not be entirely orthodox or, beautiful in its dimensions, but it's their way of getting through the night. So instead of refuting it, I think sometimes the best way is to lay alongside it something else. That there's another way of thinking of this, a story in the scriptures, a phrase, a conviction from our tradition, just to help, give the possibility of a lateral move. But I think people really sort of hammer out in moments of crisis a way they try to understand, and the delicacy of someone with a certain pastoral authority in that moment assaulting their theology is, can also be disturbing to people. But a lot of you have a lot more wisdom about that than I do. Please. Harry, it's coming.
I kind of want to follow up on that question and problematize it a little bit.
Good, I think.
How would you respond? This is something I've been working on in my academic work. With the notion that Jesus had compassion to heal people and invited them into the community, but he unintentionally set up a standard that people with disabilities have to be normalized before they can be part of the community. You don't see him doing that to the prostitute or the tax collector. It's only in the stories of healing that the healing occurs before the inclusion.
Did everybody hear the question clearly? I think it's it does problematize and gets to it. That's why I tried to, people with disabilities don't necessarily need to or want to be healed in that sense of curing. I mean, they are who they are, and this is their person. And it's true that we have in the Gospels the healing stories. I think, you're thinking of a society where sickness was very visible and a lot of eye conditions and so on, like in some traditional cultures that we see. So there was a different feel of almost epidemic of people suffering and crying out for relief. But the suffering was not simply physical. It was the attitudinal thing, the thing we all know about, the experiences underneath. And Jesus, yes, the healing, there was a kind of precondition. They're coming to him asking to be relieved of this burden they're experiencing. So they're coming to him. And he relieves the burden, but it doesn't end the process. I'm thinking of the story of the Samaritans, the 10 lepers, that some came back, they had experienced a total transformation. Others were cured, but where were they? Where I think of a very powerful story, the woman bent double in Luke chapter 13. The woman is she's bent in half, the gospel describes. So Jesus sees her in the midst of the synagogue service. He goes and says, "Woman, I untie you from your infirmity." So there's this healing. And she stands up straight, and she begins praising God. And then the synagogue manager, intervenes. So there's 6 days in which to come to be healed. Come on those days and not the Sabbath. And he attacks the woman, no, not Jesus. And then Jesus challenges the community about their perspective. So, and at the end, the synagogue community praises God, typical of Luke. So, where and whom were healed in this story? Like the healing is not consubstantial with cure. It's a profound thing. The question you raise and my attempts to answer it, it takes time. And people do make the easy thing that the normative condition for you to be really part of the community is you have to be physically whole. But I think there is a level of instinct in the gospel materials that allows the distinction between cure, which some people may desire and some people may experience and other people are not concerned about, and healing, which all of us desire and need with varying degrees of intensity. And I think it's that latter level that we have to seize upon to, in dealing with these issues. But it takes a message, because the Bible is also, it's our profound foundation, and it's part of our problem. Dealing with the biblical materials, precisely for some of the reasons you enunciate. Yes, back. You'll tell me when.
Professor Singer, when you share these texts with us, I think a lot of these texts, these stories, for many of us are very familiar. It's
Right.
It's one of the things I think we know or taught from the time we're very young about the inclusive nature of Jesus and how he reached out to people on the margins. And given that that is so fundamental to the gospel text, that's so fundamental to what the followers of Jesus have known from the beginning, why is it necessary why are we at a point now where this needs to be debated and discussed and encapsulated in church statements in order for it to fully happen, in order for people to be fully included, and not just people with disabilities, but people of any significant difference?
Right.
We've had years of theology which seems to have pushed us away from that fundamental step, and in fact some of the doctrines or things that the church has come up with have actually impeded that inclusion, which is so fundamental.
Right. Well, a profound question, and I'm not sure I have any easy answer to that. I think, as you point out, these are familiar stories. I don't know how familiar the connection is to actual experience. And especially if we broaden this from the point of view of physical transformation into the dynamics we've been talking about of accepting people and respecting people as they are and including them, with transformation all around, on the part of us coming in and the part that are being excluded. I think, what is it in our society that sinks such deep chasms ideologically and theologically between peoples? Is it a concern for identity? I think boundaries relate to identity, and when identity is fragile on the part of groups, they emphasize what divides. And if you lower the boundaries or dissolve them, you're going to change. And I think it's fearful to people. I think this was the reason for a lot of the opposition to Jesus. At that time, in the first century, Judaism, not unlike today among some Christian groups and Jewish groups, what does it mean to be a Jew? This was especially in the face of an oppressive world culture coming in, Greco-Roman culture. In the face of having lost your own political destiny, the Maccabean experience, if you like, having failed. And people, thoughtful people, Pharisees and other leaders, the Essenes, trying to debate, what does it mean to be faithful? What are the practices that distinguish us from those who are not faithful? And when you go down that road, the person who emphasizes boundary crossing, it's dangerous. It's provocative. And so I think a lot of the fears today, what does it mean? What does marriage mean? What does sexuality mean? What does our national identity mean? What does our denominational identity mean? It's a fragile time, and I think some people want to emphasize these identifying boundaries and practices with collateral damage. And I think this is where, just as you implied, here we are thinking about these familiar stories, but we have to think of them in a deeper way, I think, and interconnect them. And I think also that what Lisa evoked in her reflection this morning, and what I try to say here, that we are pushing into the very depths of the Christian faith. We're not talking about pastoral practice simply. We're talking about the very life of God and how we might reflect it. I think if we can get the discourse among people of goodwill to that level, not an easy task. I think that's where we need to be as religious leaders, not in an academic sense exclusively. That should happen too, but in a heart-to-heart sharing of our Christian faith. So these stories are symptomatic, I would say, of not just Jesus' good example, but of a pattern of reality that the Christian message discloses. And that is a different agenda, that I think we need. I don't know if that's too overstating it, but I really feel that that's very true. And that's why I think the struggle, that's why I try to say in the second thing, the witness of people who are consistently, lifelong, in so many setbacks and seeming circles, again, the witness to live that life of assaulting the boundaries and inclusion is a witness that is desperately needed by the Christian community itself and by the human community. John Paul II said, perhaps the most urgent mission for the church in the 21st century is to demonstrate that people can live together from different cultures without destroying each other. That's pretty raw statement, a very powerful statement, I think. Anyway. Oh, here comes the Grim Reaper. Not grim at all today.
I was actually thinking that's a hopeful and optimistic place for us to pause. So thank you again. If you all join me in expressing appreciation.